is Monica Ciron. I am a PhD candidate here at Illinois Tech, and my research specifically focuses on artificial intelligence ethics in agriculture, specifically within the Midwest of the United States. So this topic is very interesting to me. We have a very jam-packed session today. But before I get started, I will remind everybody again at the end, but I would like to remind everyone that we will continue with the symposium tomorrow, Saturday in the US, at 8 a.m. US Central Time. So keep that in mind. So I will just quickly name our speakers for this session: ethics, risk, and uncertainty. And then we will present in that order. So first we have Minerva Lopez from Mindanao State University in the Philippines, then followed by Anna Wedden, KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden, Andrea Giuseppe Ragnall from Ludwig Maximilians University of Munich, Germany, Fred Matthews from the University of Bristol in the United Kingdom, and Eric Brown at the International Business School Budapest in Hungary. So Minerva, if you would like to pull up your presentation and get started, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. I'm going to share my screen right now. So is it visible, guys?
Yes, I see it.
So actually, before I start, this is my first time to present internationally. So I wanna apologize first if I'm not really that good in presenting. I'm just a second-year undergraduate student from the Philippines. So my research is about to mine or not to mine the Diocese of MARBEL and Tampakan mining operations of XSTRATA-SMI in Tampakan, South Cotabato. So yeah, so my objectives for this presentation is to bring enlightenment to the audiences as to how the role of Diocese of MARBEL took the helm of the battle to stop the mining operations in Tampakan, South Cotabato, the mining operations of XSTRATA-SMI and their plans regarding open pit mining and the effects and various dangers of open pit mining in the environment and to the people. So I assume that everyone is knowledgeable about open pit mining, since we are all aware with mining operations. So South Cotabato is located in the southern part of the islands of Mindanao. Mindanao is a part of islands of the Philippines. It is bounded by the province of Sultan Kudarat in the north and west, and in the east and south by the city of General Santos and province of Sarangani. So this is one of the pictures that I'm going to be showing to you. And Tampakan is a second-class municipality in the province of South Cotabato, Philippines. So if I'm not mistaken, I got these pictures in the internet, and this is one of the mining sites of Tampakan. So the Diocese of MARBEL, the Diocese of MARBEL was established as Prelature Nullius of MARBEL in December 17, 1960. It was released from the metropolitan right of the Archdiocese of Davao and became suffragan of the newly created Archdiocese of Cotabato when the latter was elevated to the rank of an archdiocese in 1979. So today, the titular of the diocese is Christ the King. In 1939, the National Land Settlement Act opened South Cotabato to mine grants from all parts of the country. So I guess this is the first time where they established the Diocese of MARBEL. In these years, the place was served by the Omni Fathers, means Oblates of Mary Immaculate of the Prelature of Cotabato, a city in Philippines, under Reverend Gerard Monjo. After World War II, they continued to establish parishes and Notre Dame schools in the area. And Marie's brothers and religious sisters were called to help develop the fast-growing Notre Dame schools. So this is Reverend Gerard Monbiu, which is the who leads the Omni Fathers during that time. And this is the Notre Dame schools during the leadership of Reverend Gerard Monju. And this is one of the Marist brothers in Notre Dame College, General Santos City campus. General Santos City is a city in Philippines, in Mindanao as well. And as of today, this is the Notre Dame colleges today, as what the Marist brothers, the Almy fathers, and the religious sisters established. So this is the Notre Dame, as you can see in the blue, this blue picture over here in the left side. It is the Notre Dame in MARBEL and the Notre Dame in General Santos City. Diocese of MARBEL in 1958, the Passionists came to serve South Cotabato, and in December 1960, the area became the prelature of MARBEL under Reverend Quentin Olwell, as he was the first bishop assigned in the Diocese of MARBEL. Bishop Olwell established additional parishes, strengthened the Notre Dame schools, and on October 24, 1970, Reverend Reginald Arlist was installed as a second bishop, under whose term new programs and developments were initiated to answer the needs of the time, especially in the period after martial law had been declared in the Philippines. After he retired in 1981, Reverend Leonardo Gutierrez became the new bishop by succession. The prelature was elevated to a diocese in November 1982, and Bishop Gutierrez became the first residential bishop of the new diocese. The Diocese of MARBEL comprises the whole province of South Cotabato, and now it is currently headed by Bishop Cirilo Uy Casitas on April 29, 2018 by Pope Francis. So this is Reverend Olwell. He was the first bishop of the Diocese of MARBEL, and this, unfortunately, I did not have a picture of, Reverend Dinualdo Gutierrez. Reginald Arlis, rather. This is Reverend Dinualdo Gutierrez, and after the position of Reverend Dinualdo, he was the next bishop that was assigned in Diocese of MARBEL is Bishop Cirilio Uy Casitas, which he was still, Bishop Cirilio is still the bishop assigned here as of now. So the XSTRATA-SMI, the company was founded in 1926 in Switzerland. The XSTRATA Glencore PLC is an Anglo-Swiss multinational commodity trading and mining company with headquarters in Switzerland. In the 2013 Forbes Global 2000, XSTRATA was ranked as the 202nd largest public company in the world. On May 2, 2013, XSTRATA was acquired by Glencore Company and announced that its new brand name will be Glencore PLC. So as you can see, Glencore PLC bought XSTRATA for $62 billion in shares, and XSTRATA PLC is known for the world's largest exporter of thermal coal, copper, nickel, primary vanadium, and zinc, and the world's largest producer of ferrochrome. So this is one of the offices of XSTRATA in Switzerland, their mining sites. So the Sagittarius Mines Incorporated, or SMI, is a contractor of the Philippine government under the terms of Financial and Technical Assistance Agreement. SMI's head office is located at the municipality of Tampakan, South Cotabato, where their mining sites located, and has offices in the municipality of Polomolok, South Cotabato, and at the Mall of Asia complex in Pasay City, a city in one of the islands of Philippines. SMI is known for its mining operations in Tampakan, South Cotabato, and currently partnered with Tampakan Copper Gold Project, one of the largest undeveloped copper gold deposits in the world. In June 2003, XSTRATA Copper entered into an option agreement with Indophil, which as well as an option to acquire management control of SMI. In May 2013, with the merger between XSTRATA and Glencore PLC, was finalized, assuming controlling equity interest of SMI and the management of Tampakan project. Domestic corporations owns 100% of the common shares of SMI and holds full economic control of the company. So this is one of the logos of SMIs, and Indophil, who owns some percents of SMI's fund, and this is one of the offices of SMI in Tampakan, South Cotabato. So the Diocese of MARBEL and Tampakan mining operations, the Tampakan copper gold projects in the Philippines owned by Glencore XSTRATA, known for the largest copper gold mines in Southeast Asia. It covers a mined area of around 10,000 hectares. The municipalities of Malungon, all of the places that I will be mentioning here is one of the places who is known for its abundance in forests, trees, and the project directly impacts watersheds, around 3,000 hectares of forest, and ancestral domains that are sacred for local populations. An estimate of 5,000 people, mostly indigenous people, will have to be resettled as a consequence of the mining, and many more are likely to be affected. In 2017, the mining operations of Glencore XSTRATA was canceled up until now due to environmental and social concerns. One of the people behind the cancellation of the mining operations of Glencore XSTRATA was the former DENR Secretary of the Philippines, which is Gina Lopez. The Diocese of MARBEL is the most active organization who stands for the banning of opening the mining in Tampakan, South Cotabato. And for my opinion, why Diocese of MARBEL is one of the most active organizations, because church teaches people to protect the nature, protect the environment, because we are the stewards of God's creation. They organized a campaign named Protect Nature, Protect Our Future, which was launched on August 16, 2021, whereas church leaders and representatives of the Diocese of MARBEL in the southern Philippines submitted the petition with 78,229 signatures, 38,801 from the province, and 45,428 from the rest of the country, showing the people's opposition to open pit mining in the province. Since I'm still a student, and at that time I cannot join for their campaign. So what the least that I can do is to sign that petition, and I am one of the people who signed that campaign, and I am proud of it, because even if I am just a student, a small bean student, I showed support for the Diocese of MARBEL and their operations to banning the opening of the mining operations of Tampakan. So this is the church leaders and representatives of the Diocese of MARBEL marched to the provincial capital in the province of South Cotabato. So this is the people who organized the campaign named Protect Nature and Protect Our Future. The Diocese of MARBEL, Bishop Cirilo Casicas, urged the parishioners, particularly the youth, to make the signature campaign viral, as he stressed that areas without internet service will be reached through basic Christian communities. During the term of the late MARBEL Bishop Dinualdo Gutierrez, launched a campaign during the 2013, as you can see this picture over here, election dam Team Pabor, Team Ayo, which was translated to a Filipino dialect. But Team Pabor, Team Ayo means team in favor and team not in favor, which sought to educate the local voters regarding the running candidates who are in favor in the opening of mining in Tampakan. Bishop Gutierrez decided to post tarpaulins. This is big tarpaulins containing the names of candidates whose favor and oppose the planned open pit mining activity in South Cotabato. According to my research, Bishop Gutierrez did not show the candidates who are opposed to the planning of open pit mining activity. Why say no to open pit mining? As what our topic today, climate change, as we all know that mining can lead to climate change, right? Open pit mining can bring negative impacts to the agricultural lands of the province. It will destroy the watersheds. Around 3,000 hectares of forest and ancestral domains that are sacred for local populations will be teared down, especially the indigenous people who live there. The operations will also endanger food and water sources, impacting living conditions and possibly leading to social unrest. The risk of pollution, erosion, siltation, flash floods, landslide, and other seismic geohazards are also very high. Tampakan is known for its rich in nature. It has a lot of the islands of Mindanao is known to have abundance in mountains, and we have to protect that. And right now, earthquakes are now occurring in the region. And if mining begins in the province, the earthquakes are likely to worsen. So the last month, earthquakes are happening in our region. So if this would be happening, if the people would approve this open pit mining, maybe earthquakes will worse likely to happen, and the effects of the mining in the future is to the future generations. So this is what I want to do to my platform as a student. I want to speak to the voiceless, to the indigenous people there who lives in the mining sites. They cannot say what they want because they don't have a chance to say, because they think that they are, as what I've said, they are voiceless. So I am, as my platform, I am talking to the future generations and to the indigenous people who live in the location of the mining operations. This is the before and after pictures of the effects of one of the effects of mining in islands of Mindanao in the Philippines. This is the before and this is the after, and people really think that this is the effect of the mining operations in their area. And imagine the fishes who died at that time, the corals. Philippines is known for the corals. And this is my little platform to inform the people about the effects, the future effects. Yes, we cannot see the effects right now, but for the future, we must protect, since we are the protector of the God's creation. So before I end, I'm gonna leave you guys a quote from Catherine Susanna Pritchard. The mining industry might make wealth and power for a few men and women, but the many would always be smashed and battered beneath its giant treads. Thank you so much and good day.
Thank you, Minerva. I'm going to hold questions until the end because I have 4 more presenters. So please keep your questions or put them in the chat, and then we will get to them at the end, or we will email them to each other. So our next presenter, oh, and I wanted to say, Minerva, congratulations on your first international presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. So Anna, I will turn it over to you.
Great. So good day, good evening, good morning, all of that. I'm very happy to be here to talk a bit about my research that I'm doing in relation to ethical adaptation to rising sea levels. And I'm going to be talking about the concept of feasibility today. And I'm actually expected to give birth next week, so I'm hoping you will excuse my close reading of my notes. I'm not really able to keep anything else in my head today. But anyways, so the concept of feasibility has come to play an increasingly important part in the climate change debate. And at a press conference leading up to the release of the special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, Dr. Ho Sung Lee, the chair of the IPCC, said, "One notion that runs through all of this is feasibility. How feasible is it to limit warming to 1.5 degrees? How feasible is it to develop the technologies that will get us there? We must analyze policy measures in terms of feasibility." And of course, this prompts the question, what exactly do we mean by feasibility? On the most basic level, we can say that feasibility means that something can be done in practice. But when analyzing the climate debate, it's quite clear that the term is used in a variety of different ways. Why is this a problem then? Well, feasibility can be seen as a normative constraint. So if something is deemed unfeasible, it can be suggested that we are not morally required to do it. If the term is used too lightly, we therefore risk dismissing necessary goals and actions. And at the same time, feasibility can be a useful parameter when we are comparing and choosing between climate goals and action. So given the currency of the situation, we don't want to waste our time on stuff that is not doable in practice, so stuff that is not feasible. Given this tension, I will try to make sense of the concept of feasibility. I will use some literature and theories from the political philosophy field, especially when it comes to ideal theory. And I will point out that in the climate change context, there are different uses, some that talk about feasibility in a too narrow way, which excludes a lot of stuff that should be seen as feasible, but also point towards some too broad definitions and understandings. And after I've done that, hopefully, if time permits, I will be able to present a positive account of how I think feasibility should be understood in the climate change context. And this can help make sense of feasibility in practical deliberation. So I will start, like I said, by mentioning two accounts of narrow understandings of feasibility. These are called cost-based accounts of feasibility and probability-based accounts of feasibility. So beginning with cost-based accounts, I read a recent study which gave an assessment on the political feasibility of achieving the 1.5 degree target by 2100, and it was concluded that it is politically infeasible. And the reason for why it was considered infeasible is that it was claimed that the costs of the required actions are too high compared to the capacity to bear those costs. However, such high costs alone cannot be sufficient to dismiss actions as infeasible in practical deliberation. One can easily imagine situations where an action is deemed to have an undue cost, but where alternative actions are unachievable without even higher costs. So limiting global warming will without a doubt be difficult to achieve, in part due to its high costs, but this alone does not mean that it's infeasible. So therefore, we should not rely on cost-based accounts of feasibility, as they do not capture everything that is feasible. Another too narrow understanding is based on probability, where the likelihood of a goal or an outcome determines whether it's seen as feasible or not. However, there are things with low probability that nevertheless can be seen as feasible. For example, it's highly unlikely that I would sing the remainder of this presentation, but it's nevertheless feasible. And it is feasible that we will implement a global cap and trade system, even though it seems quite unlikely. If we are understanding feasibility as depending on probability, this tends to allow present circumstances dictate what is seen as available options. And this can mean letting agents off the hook easily. So if you have this understanding of feasibility in terms of likelihood, there's a risk that you're limiting the space for cutting edge proposals and instead reinforce a status quo. So that's why we have to be careful of using these narrow understandings of feasibility. It's if we use the term too lightly, there's the risk ruling out necessary action, and we must be cautious for doing that. But then there's also a risk in depending on too broad understandings of feasibility. And here I will depart from the IPCC definition of feasibility. The IPCC defines feasibility as the degree to which climate goals and response options are considered possible and or desirable. Feasibility depends on geophysical, ecological, technological, economic, social, and institutional conditions for change. Conditions underpinning feasibility are dynamic, spatially variable, and may vary between different groups. So there's a lot of aspects of this definition that are interesting to discuss, but I will focus on that it's saying that feasibility are the degree to which climate goals and response actions are considered possible and or desirable. And this is problematic that they're saying that it's depending on possibility and or desirability. To begin with, it's problematic because it means feasibility can be understood in three different ways, as either possible, desirable, or both. This makes the definition too broad and includes a lot of stuff, and limits the use of feasibility as a factor in practical deliberation. Moreover, specifically, possibility and desirability are terms that should be kept apart in practical deliberation. Possibility is a descriptive term and can constrain the space within goals can be fulfilled, whereas desirability is much more normative and should be setting the goals. So they are both very important, of course, in practical deliberation, but they serve different purposes. So I would do the claim or the bold proposal that and or desirable should be removed from this definition. I think feasibility should not be normative, it should be more descriptive. But that leaves us with a definition that says that feasibility is the degree to which climate goals and response options are considered possible. And this is perhaps too broad still, because it fails to provide action guidance, and it's not really in line with our intuitive understanding of feasibility as a restricted notion of possibility. So it's not perfect, and we want to find something that's in between these narrow understandings and this broad understanding. And here I'm happy to have found an account in political philosophy that I believe helps address some of these issues and address the problem of feasibility in the climate change context. And this solution is called the conditional probability account of feasibility, and is a theory that has been presented by the political philosophers Gilbert and Lawford Smith about a decade ago. They suggest that an outcome is feasible if and only if there exists an agent with an action in her option set within the relevant time period that has a positive probability of bringing it about. So this means that an outcome is feasible if therefore an agent exists a trajectory from the current state to a desired outcome within a specific time frame. And this kind of trajectory is dependent on constraints that limit feasibility and make it a more restricted notion of possibility. So specifically, they talk about two types of constraints. There are hard constraints and soft constraints. And these hard constraints, they are permanent and absolute, and they are such that they will always be constraints and are important for the understanding of feasibility in a more binary sense. So these are the ones that rule out options completely, but they are also quite few. These are not, costs or likelihood or political institutions that are limiting, but these are more biological constraints or things like that. On the other hand, they talk about soft constraints that are more malleable. These can be shifted, for example, through technological innovation, political revolution, and radical cultural transformation. And the existence of soft constraints, they are not sufficient to dismiss actions and proposals and goals. In fact, the authors are quite firm in pointing out that giving the soft constraints too much normative weight would involve accepting the status quo, and that should not be done. Instead, the role of these soft constraints is to provide a basis for comparative assessments. So by focusing on soft constraints, you can talk about what is more or less feasible. And this, I think, is very useful when we use feasibility in a climate change context. It's not so that we can dismiss actions, but it can still be helpful in practical deliberation. So I believe that understanding feasibility in this way can help in making priorities and inform planning, financing, and implementation of climate action. It provides conceptual tools for examining feasibility as a restricted notion of possibility without dismissing goals and actions too lightly. Moreover, when we look at feasibility constraints as dynamic in this sense, there's room for a constructive debate on how it's possible to shift constraints and how we can expand the feasibility space and open up for more possible actions. And this, I think, is very important, given that far too little is being done in relation to what is needed in terms of climate action. So to conclude, we should be cautious of how we talk about feasibility of climate change goals and actions, since it can have normative implications. Today, both too narrow and too broad definitions are used. And one account that I believe balances between these is this conditional probability account of feasibility. This emphasizes hard and soft constraints, which means that fewer actions are ruled out on the basis of them being infeasible, but instead emphasizes how it's possible to shift what is seen as feasible. So I think I spoke too fast, but I didn't want us to run over time. That was what I had to say, and I hope this made some sense, and if not fully, at least that I might have convinced some of you that feasibility is an important concept to further investigate in order to enable efficient and strong climate action. So
thank you, Anna.
Thank you.
It's fantastic. And congratulations to you as well in a week. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Oh, congratulations. All right. Well, keep your questions in mind for Anna until the end. And let's move on to Andre. I'll hand it over to you and you can start sharing.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to start sharing my screen. All right. All right. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Because it's appearing.
Maybe a little lag.
Can you quickly change slide? Sorry, I'm having some problems. Okay. Yeah. Maybe I should go like this. All right. So thank you, everyone, for having me. This is a combined project with a computer science PhD student in Munich. That's where I study. He's from a different university, Munich. And so this is a very new project, let's say. So we're still working on it. And today, for me, it was a way to have a platform where to present the project and gather hopefully some feedback. And the way this little project is structured is that I would bring, let's say, the philosophical question related to philosophy of climate change, and this computer science student would sort of bring let's say a computational methodology to answer this question. So yeah, it's an interdisciplinary project, and yeah, let's see how that plays out. Okay, so this is the summary of the talk, and as I said, it's still a new project, so I will mostly be presenting let's say previous results coming from let's say similar projects, and then I would like to briefly present how we can extend this with the latest with an analysis of the latest IPCC report. So first of all, so the project basically would like to investigate on the role of consensus in climate change, in climate science, And the way to do that is, first of all, to look at what the scientists actually mean by consensus, and therefore how scientists use consensus as a sort of a measure to assess a certain piece of evidence that we can gather from the literature, or in general from certain studies in climate science. So the way, first of all, before presenting the role of consensus in the IPCC, I would like just to very briefly present the skills that the scientists use in the IPCC to sort of assess uncertainty and therefore to present it to policymaker. Because obviously the important thing here is to keep in mind is that obviously the way we use, for instance, consensus or other metrics to assess, let's say, the evidence that we have is a way also they are translating in a certain sense to policymakers in order for them to make specific policies, climate policies. So the IPCC provides, I think in 2010 has provided comprehensive assessments. So the IPCC in general, yeah, provides a comprehensive assessment of the state of art of climate change, and also not only the physical basis behind climate change, but also the strategies for strategies like how we can respond and adapt to the impact of climate change. As you may know already, the IPCC is divided in 3 working groups, and each working group has a different topic broad topic to assess. In 2010, so before the 5th IPCC assessment report, the system of uncertainty language was designed specifically to coherently characterize, first of all, and communicate uncertainty, not only between the 3 working groups, but also between the chapters that make the working groups, and most importantly, for the reports used to communicate the science, let's say the main findings to policymakers. Yeah, the IPCC basically recommends its author to use 3 different scales to qualify uncertainty. So there's the evidence scale, so the quality of the evidence that we have. There's agreement and therefore some sort of degree of consensus that we may have, and the likelihood scale. The first 2, the evidence and the agreement, are combined, are used to have let's say a combined scale, which is called confidence scale. And so first of all, yeah, the evidence scale allows the authors to separately evaluate the type, amount, and quality of the evidence supporting a certain claim. And then there is, as I mentioned, the level of scientific agreement, which is more intended to evaluate the degree of convergence of scholars over a specific claim. But this is just one, let's say, intuition to characterize agreement. And in the IPCC, in the 5th, and our project will look more at the 6th report, there's an incoherent way to characterize consensus amongst scientists, and philosophically that could be a bit counterintuitive, and that's where philosophical questions come into the play. So both the quality of evidence and the level of agreement are 3-point scales, so they can be assessed limited, medium, robust for the former, while for the latter they can be assessed as low, medium, and high agreement. One of the critiques for these scales is that the recommendations on evidence agreement are not generic enough, since evaluating evidence and agreement highly depend on the context of the topic of area. So it seems that one of the shortcomings that was related to the fact that the uncertainty language system was used to coherently characterize uncertainty between chapters. So one of the shortcomings of this scale is that it's not possible to coherently characterize uncertainty because of the specificity of certain different topics in climate science and that are analyzed in the IPCC. Then there's this combined scale between evidence, the quality of evidence, how robust it is, and the level of agreement that combined into a confidence scale. And this is a 5-point confidence scale. So there's very high, medium, low, and very low. And some combination that are being used throughout the IPCC do not seem to have a straightforward translation in the 5 points confidence scale. So for instance, there are like sort of like borderline cases such as a robust evidence medium agreement, where we're not entirely sure whether we should assess this, we should translate these claims as with high confidence or very high confidence or medium confidence. And then in the end, there is a more, let's say, quantitative scale, which is basically the likelihood scale. And as opposed to the previous two, the likelihood scale is used to communicate quantified probabilistic assessments of uncertainty. And they're being used with statistical or modeling analysis, or also formal elicitation methods. And this scale provides 10 likelihood, is a 10-point scale, as you can see on the graph. And likelihood by the IPCC is intended as a strictly quantitative concept that is measured and communicated using largely frequentist probabilities, although this does seem a bit at odds with a more Bayesian conception of probability, because some scholars have argued in the previous years that the IPCC framework is built upon a somewhat convoluted interpretation of probability. So sometimes we may have some probabilistic statements that are more frequentist as opposed as Bayesian, like more related to Bayesian probability theory. And moreover, the guidance note specifies that confidence should not be interpreted probabilistically, which again may strike as counterintuitive, because that's the very notion of subjective interpretation of probability, and therefore like the very notion of Bayesian probability. And therefore it's unclear why confidence statements cannot be quantified and expressed probabilistically. So this is one of the shortcomings of this guidance note that has not been revised so far. And as far as I know, they're not planning to revise it. They're using the same one also for the 6th assessment report. I will skip for the time. I will skip this example. Now I'm just going to quickly talk about how the uncertainty scales are used in the summary, in the IPCC, in order to provide again a translation of certain claims to policymakers. There were some authors that recently have started sort of checking the trend of certain terms, certain uncertainty terms appearing. So for instance, they were noticing that the rate of, like overall in absolute numbers, the rate of uncertainty terms has improved quite a lot in the last assessment reports. And this scholars have also noticed that the composition of such terms have also dramatically changed from the 4th to the 5th assessment report. So as you can see, for instance, in the first working group, so the one related to the physical basis of climate change, the confidence terms have gained importance and have reached almost 50%. The likelihood one have decreased, meaning that now with the confidence terms statements, we may have more meta probabilistic judgments. And so this could be like a proxy to start indicating this, that there is a different type of uncertainty that we're facing within the science behind climate change. And in particular, the trends that have been noting is that more graphs have been used to communicate uncertainty in terms often do not seem to be attached to a particular probability interval, which goes against this guidance note that was made in 2010, I revised 2011, which could confuse readers across not only working groups, but also chapters, to interpret likelihood terms as assessments of quantitative evidence. And also what has been noted is that more uncertainty statements with different terms of uncertainty terms have been combined or integrated in the summary for policymakers. So sometimes you would see some confidence skills terms with likelihood skills terms used together. So this author, Market, and others have considered the last point that I mentioned as an example of meta assessments, where the assessor basically assigns an uncertainty term that applies to the aggregated evidence and agreement of the two subclaims. So what this means is that sometimes what has been noted is that when you try to, let's say, translate particular claims from the technical report to the summary for policymakers, they try to generalize over these particular claims into a bigger, broader one with the help of uncertainty terms. So epistemically, this is not. Some other authors say that this is not entirely justified. And it can sound a bit counterintuitive. So these trends also have witnessed the disappearance of evidence and agreement statements in the summary for policymakers. Terms such as robust evidence and also terms such as high or medium agreement are disappearing in the summary of policymakers, and instead of that, they're using more confidence terms. So that they would just say that there is a certain medium, high, very high, or low confidence over a certain claim. And now, finally, it comes the role of consensus and what scientists mean by consensus. So the first working group, so the three working groups seems to have some sort of similar, although there are some nuances, notions of agreement. So in the fifth assessment report, the first working group states that the IPCC process is aimed at assessing the literature as it stands, so the conversion of evidence in the literature, and attempts to reflect the level of reasonable scientific consensus as well as a disagreement. In the second group contrasts agreement with evidential consistency more explicitly. So beyond consistency, and then I would also say robust evidence, the degree of agreement indicates the consensus within the scientific community on a topic and the degree to which established speculative scientific explanation exists. And finally, the third working group sees consensus as the degree of certainty or uncertainty of a given topic as a measure of consensus or agreement across the scientific community. So the last one is the more general, again, I would say probably the more intuitive for so less, let's say, detailed notion of consensus. And one of the goals of the project that I would start doing is looking at how consensus is viewed in the last IPCC report. So these three statements, first of all, tell us several things: that agreement is a valid epistemic role in the IPCC. So peer agreement is very important to assess certain claims, a certain research, and therefore is an epistemic measure. So it comes in degrees. Agreement is viewed as consensus in the scientific community, and as also at the same time as concurrence of published results. And then, I mean, apart from the fact that agreement and disagreement, again, because of the fact that agreement is viewed as sort of like something that comes in degrees, also disagreement is as important as agreement. And then finally, the agreement is not equivalent to consistency of evidence, and therefore assessing evidence, pieces of evidence individually is different from assessing the scientific agreement over a certain claim backed by such evidence. So a similar project that someone did with the fifth assessment report to what I would like to do in a more extensive way, and that is why I'm collaborating with another PhD student. Is this Regan-Stally paper from 2016, where they find a few cases of concurrence version of consensus, and also another version of consensus that is confidence as consensus. And this so they find these 3 cases only throughout the IPCC. And these 3 cases are linked to the practice of, as I mentioned before, like a meta-assessing, and therefore like assessing probabilistic judgments. And then also reconstructing claims made from the literature in the chapter bodies. Also, agreement can be identified by visually examining the close alignment of published trends, and so like literally enumerating the number of papers in the literature that are reporting that same claim. And therefore, they also mention one example there that basically represents such a view of consensus in the IPCC. And obviously, if you would have over 100 papers published, 100 papers, they all report the same claim. Therefore, you would have 100% of consensus over such claim. And the only problem is that, so Regestali do argue that in some cases, the research teams who publish results in the literature are not in the position to, so the scientists themselves that made the research would not necessarily be in the position to fully agree with the claims reported in the IPCC, because their research, the research made by the scientists cited in the IPCC only test limited claims, like sort of, you would say, sub-claims that are then generalized in the IPCC. And a way to also generalize them is also to bring and say that there is agreement over these views when there is actually not really agreement over this more generalized claim. There might be agreement in the single sub-claims, but then when you look at the whole bigger, broader claim, there is no agreement on that as such. So there is a worry there for the view of agreement as consensus in the scientific community. This may not be valid, as opposed to the convergence of research. And often, in fact, the claims made by the authors on the IPCC are higher level than claims present in the literature. Finally, what the Regestali have been doing is comparing the views of agreement used by the authors of the IPCC with 2 philosophical versions of consensus. And basically, they say that these 2 versions of info that we have in the philosophy literature cannot be compared to these versions of consensus that we have in the IPCC. So first of all, the veritistic conception cannot capture the notions of consensus in the IPCC, simply because the type of uncertainty, the epistemic uncertainty we have in climate science cannot be captured by this veritistic conception of consensus. And then the second conception of consensus that we have in the literature that was designed by Boaz Miller almost, I believe, 15 years ago. Basically, he came up with certain 4 conditions that can make agreement justified. And unfortunately, we do not have, we cannot keep track of these conditions in the IPCC. So both these 2 versions of philosophy fail to capture the notions of agreement in the IPCC. So the future questions that I would have for my project, and then I will end my talk, is first of all, extensively classifying the notions of consensus and agreement in the latest IPCC report, because as I said, the 2 authors, Regestali, they only report 3 examples, but with an algorithm and a natural processing language algorithm that would be designed by my collaborator, we would look at hopefully hold the cases and see if there are other notions that cannot be captured by these 2. Then second of all, I would like to compare the implicit conditions which, according to ADI authors at the IPCC, make consensus good evidence to support certain claims, with other conceptions of reliable consensus in the philosophy literature. So expand and see whether other notions of consensus in philosophy can capture one or more notions of consensus in the IPCC. And finally, I would like to evaluate and justify the rationale behind this sort of pluralism of consensus in the IPCC, which is, again, throughout the whole three working bodies. Yeah, and then there are also some other questions for discussion. There is remaining so clear after reading the Reagan study paper what has caused the disappearance of agreement terms in the latest IPCC, in the fifth, sorry, and then I will check what's happening in the sixth as well. Then we could evaluate whether more notions of consensus or epistemic arguments for agreement would fit for the two notions of consensus. And finally, issues regarding the role of values and potential biases affecting research are unexplored by the IPCC. Yeah, this is something important to investigate, I believe, because this would relapse into the justificatory notion of consensus that we have in philosophy. So that was all. I really apologize if I went over time, but thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, you bring up some really interesting topics. I'm particularly interested in the variety of philosophical views of consensus, but also your mentioning of like the disappearance of agreement terms. So I think there's some good things to be discussed. But I will turn it over to Fred for now, and you can start your presentation.
Okay, thanks very much. Let me just share my screen. Okay, is everybody able to see that?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about, should those behind Rawls' veil of ignorance know about the science of climate change? I'd like to start off by talking about why this is such an important topic. I think it's important because Rawlsian liberalism still remains probably the most dominant paradigm in sort of political philosophy, at least in kind of like Anglo-American political philosophy. So it's always interesting, I think, to see how this kind of dominant political dominant paradigm can stand up to some of the most pressing applied issues. And as we've already heard today, climate change is one of the most pressing applied ethical issues there is. Okay, so I'm going to start off with just a brief overview of what Rawls' veil of ignorance is. So what Rawls was looking for is an impartial procedure for discovering society's basic principles of justice. So it takes away knowledge of individual characteristics you might have so that you won't be tempted to choose principles of justice that would favor yourself or people close to you, so you don't know your class, your ethnicity, your religion, etc. And it also takes away knowledge about your conception of the good, so you don't know what your goals and ends in life are going to be. You don't know if you're going to be a hedonist or whether you're going to be a Christian or an atheist or whatever. So it enshrines the kind of principles of, or the values of, tolerance and state neutrality. So everybody should be able to pursue their own conception of the good, and the state should not take sides between different individual ways of living. But Rawls does allow knowledge behind the veil. Even if he doesn't allow individual knowledge, he still has this very interesting clause about being able to know about general social facts, right? And this is a very crude example I have here about whether human beings are genetically aggressive or whether we're kind and gentle. Obviously, the answer to that is, well, neither, because it's an extremely complex question. But obviously, you need to have some knowledge of psychology. You need to have some knowledge of basic facts about human nature and things like that. So Rawls allows this clause into his description of the veil of ignorance, where The parties know facts about human society, political affairs, economic theory, and so on. Now, obviously, what's going to count as an uncontroversial fact to itself be controversial, right? So particularly when it comes to things like economics or laws of human psychology, I don't know exactly what Rawls did have in mind there. But obviously, you know, it's pretty clear that there's going to be contention about what counts. But you would think knowledge about environmental issues would certainly count, given that, you know, human-induced climate change and other serious ecological problems like mass extinction and overfishing and deforestation are all kind of subject to a sort of rough scientific consensus that, you know, there's a general consensus that it's happening, and it's not a kind of you know, it's not a contentious position in economics or psychology. It's a fact of the natural sciences, right? So you would imagine that climate change could be treated as a kind of fixed fact. So, in the words of Andrew Reid, climate change can be a fixed fact that all reasonable citizens agree upon in public deliberation, and by extension, participants in the veil of ignorance would treat that as a fixed fact. So while we don't necessarily know about the science itself, I mean, I don't understand the science, people behind the veil, we can assume that they would understand something about the relatively reliable knowledge producing mechanisms that lead to this scientific consensus. But there is a legitimate question to be asked here about, there is disagreement amongst experts still. So there's broad agreement that climate change is happening and it's a serious issue. But there is disagreement, I think, about how bad things are or will get. So there are different, I've given some examples here of different scientists giving more optimistic or more pessimistic views of how things are going to turn out. And also, of course, there's disagreement about how well-equipped current societies are to actually deal with this problem. So given this disagreement, you might wonder, like, well, whether knowledge about ecological issues would affect the choice of the principles of justice behind the veil of ignorance. So yeah, this is an example of how some scientists might take seriously mass civilizational collapse, but it would be rejected by others. So you might wonder what people would make of this and how it would impact their choice of principles of justice, whether it would impact them given the disagreement amongst experts that they don't really understand that well. So I take it that the most straightforward solution to this is that people behind the veil would be risk averse. So what they would do is they know the uncontroversial fact that climate change is happening. They know it's a serious problem. They're permitted to know that some climate scientists think that we are facing well, you know, a ghastly future, or, you know, serious or potentially mass civilizational collapse, or some other really horrendous stuff. Just as they wouldn't choose, in Rawls' opinion, very unequal societies in case they're at the bottom. They probably, you might say, they would choose to be ecologically prudent. They would choose principles that enshrine risk aversion. So they would choose to maybe, enshrine a principle of, ecological preservation or something like that, or a clause about ecological preservation in the principles of justice, because they are being risk averse. So here's the problem, though, that if we take everything that we've, if we take it as it's unfolded so far, the people behind the veil are permitted knowledge about climate change, they're permitted knowledge about other environmental problems. They know some scientists, a lot of credible scientists, think that this is, one of the greatest problems humanity's ever known, and you might get, half the world uninhabitable in 50 or 100 years or whatever. They know all of that, and they're risk averse. You might think that they're not going to choose liberal principles of justice at all. You might think this knowledge would weigh so heavily that actually they would choose something other than liberalism or liberal democracy. So Rawls makes the assumption that, people behind the veil would prioritize individual liberty. But if you're facing the climate crisis, and if individual decisions to contribute to the climate crisis are permitted by individual liberty, you might think that they would, at the very least, they'd scale that back and not give it the kind of lexical priority that Rawls imagines. So there are alternatives to liberalism that they could choose on the basis of this knowledge, such as green politics or eco-socialism, or, even you might call it environmental authoritarianism. They might seem like green politics and eco-socialism might seem like safer alternatives. So they might demand radical action to combat global warming, including limiting the ability of including limiting individual freedom in some cases, where, that individual freedom is actually the thing that is driving the climate change or the environmental degradation. They may leave some room, they'd still leave some room for it perhaps, but they wouldn't prioritize it. And of course, it's worth pointing out that not all environmentalists are soft, or, that some of them are of the view that, in the words of Robert Heilbronner, only iron governments have the tools necessary to deal with environmental problems. So with all this knowledge, it's not clear that people behind the veil of ignorance would choose liberalism. And, it might be too extreme to say they'd opt for something like environmental authoritarianism, but the idea that they would go for something that's non-liberal, like eco-socialism, that says we can, legitimately curtail individual freedom in some cases beyond, what would be acceptable for liberals. That's certainly plausible. And it goes without saying that's not what Rawls wanted. That this seems to go against, he seems to believe that, the veil of ignorance is going to lead to liberal principles being enshrined. If you don't know who you're going to be and you have knowledge of general social facts, you're going to choose liberalism. So what they seem to be in need of, I think, is some method for protecting liberalism. And I'm not proposing that this is a very, probably a very satisfying response. But if Rawls is going to stop this kind of conclusion from becoming a possibility, he needs to acknowledge that the original position is already rigged to give liberal conclusions, or that it's kind of got liberalism built into it. So the veil, it's probably fair to say the veil of ignorance is already biased towards liberalism. And there are places, I think, where Rawls tacitly admits this. So, for example, Rex Martin has pointed out that, because you don't know who you're going to be, it intrinsically biases you against things like, anti-egalitarian systems. So the veil already has a kind of egalitarian bias built into it. And of course, if we're going to introduce general knowledge of social facts and so on, as Rawls did, you might think that you need a way of interpreting these facts in a way that's favorable to liberalism already, in order to make sure that we still get liberalism. So the best path, I think, for Rawlsians would be to admit that the veil of ignorance already enshrines, the deck is already stacked towards believing liberalism is the best system. Not an impartial method for showing the superiority of liberalism, but a device for choosing between different liberal distributive principles, I would say. So that means that you could salvage something from the veil of ignorance, I think, but without actually saying that this is an argument for liberalism as such, or something that shows the superiority of liberalism, if that's what it was intended for. So in that way, you might think, the environmental issue, they could still know about it behind the veil, but the range of options for actually responding to that with would be curtailed. So if on that reading, then the veil of ignorance would not be seen as something, knowledge about climate change or environmental issues would not be seen as something that would threaten liberalism, because these other systems I'm talking about would be ruled out. And of course, this leaves a very interesting question. I think this shows very clearly that Rawlsians need Rawlsians are in need of some other way of demonstrating that liberalism is in fact superior, or is in fact the best system for, for humanity going forward. I think that it raises some really interesting questions about the continuing relevance or the sort of new threats to the liberal paradigm. I think well, I mean, if they were to take the line of defense that I've just taken, it does raise questions about how their arguments for liberalism actually do work, why we would be permitted to rule out these alternatives, and so on and so forth. All right, that's my presentation done.
Thank you. Very interesting. My head is spinning because I have so many things. I see connections between your presentations already, but I need to get one more presenter in here. So Eric, I will turn it over to you and then we can debrief here. Thank you very much, Fred.
Okay, one moment, please. I will
Sure.
To, there we are. So what I'm going to, hopefully it'll show up. Oh, there it goes. Okay, I'm going to leave the sidebar open because I'm probably going to have to jump around for the sake of time. I am going to just introduce some of the ideas around the way some institutions that have a lot of influence globally, such as in this case the World Bank, are pushing a kind of agenda for dealing with development in lesser developed countries in relation to sustainable development goals. But I think ultimately all has to do a great deal with climate change and those issues related as well. It's going to be rather critical because I think that this is a little bit problematic. So here we go. The program is called Maximizing Finance for Development, and it's aimed at trying to get as much private money into developing countries for the purposes of meeting sustainable development infrastructure goals. Everything from energy production to energy distribution, but also education systems and health systems and transportation systems. And I actually think all of those are pretty interrelated. I think that you really can't say that you are going to have even a sustainable society that's going to be able to deal with climate issues if you haven't raised people with enough education to be able to contribute to society in a lot of sort of very flexible ways. So first, I want to introduce the idea of infrastructure. It's not because you don't know what it is, everybody sort of does, but it's but because we have to keep a couple of features in mind about it that maybe we just don't think about very often. Usually infrastructure we think of as something that is public and shared, and that most people can just use it. And the idea behind building infrastructure is that when an individual uses it for his or her own purposes, it is going to, help them, but also create positive externalities for other people and maybe for society in general. One of the most important things to remember about infrastructure for the purpose of what I'm going to be talking about is that building infrastructure is time and resource intensive. Like these are almost always long-term projects. Think about building you can take a great deal of time. And I'm going to use the term infrastructure fairly broadly to include schools, roads, hospitals, but also different systems that have to do with helping people develop on their own. And we can even talk about markets even as based on an infrastructure that's based on laws and technology and so on. Now, for us to have some sort of equitable transition to like a net zero society, or society where we'll at least curb carbon emissions a great deal, where a great deal of infrastructure is going to need to be produced and put into place. This is, of course, especially in developing worlds, but even in developed countries. For instance, in the United States, we need to basically re-electrify most of the country. Now, but the important part about infrastructure in this case that we're talking about is that we are not going to just have to develop infrastructure that is for the sake of adaptation, for the sake of mitigation of carbon emissions. We're going to have to build infrastructure that is itself adaptive to, in other words, it is itself adaptive to climate change. So mitigation and adaptation here are two parts of basically the same story. This infrastructure is always going to be at risk, of course, in different ways in different parts of the world, because of extreme weather events, other environmental changes, and of course, to really face facts, social effects, such as the fact that at some point in the not so far off future, it's going to be really difficult for people to work outside for any long period of time, let alone the sorts of conflict there might be over resources and arable land and things of that nature. So this infrastructure has to be very robust and it has to be able to stand up against a range of possible risks. Now, so to the finance part, this is an approach where the World Bank is dedicating a lot of resources and advice, as it were, to helping developing countries de-risk their economies, and I'll get to what that means in a moment, so that private investors, especially these giant pools of money that have been that are accessible by asset managers like BlackRock, and also pension funds and more active asset management funds. So that money can just sort of flow in and help to find projects that can be built to develop countries around the world where development is necessary. Now, what do we mean by de-risking? Well, okay, there's regulatory de-risking, public-private partner. That is just sort of the idea that the state is going to either sort of eliminate regulations or promise, contractually oblige itself to not change regulations in ways that might be inconvenient for investors. Public-private partnerships are a way of making sure that the state that infrastructure is not free for citizens' use. They have to pay to use it. But that's not so unusual, because I think we're used to sort of, anywhere in the world, maybe you pay to use the bus. But part of the idea behind public-private partnerships is that if say the transportation system that has been built isn't profitable enough for the investors, then the state is going to compensate the investors. Also loosening of capital controls and things of that nature, so that the capital in these investments become more liquid, and that can be moved out if the projects don't seem to be working out the way that the investors would like them to. So they have sort of put this into a very handy little flow chart for us. The first thing you should do, according to the World Bank, is see if, I hope you can see this, but if not, you can always look it up. It's fairly, you can, their little schemas everywhere. You first just try private finance, right? Now, the anticipation here, of course, is that that's not really going to work. for a number of different reasons. But one of the first is that there's just going to be too many regulations, or there's going to be regulatory uncertainty. And in countries, so many countries in the developing world are kind of politically volatile. So regulatory uncertainty is a real thing. That's really should be admitted. Okay, but if eliminating regulatory uncertainty by making contracts to not change regulations and so on isn't convincing enough to private finance, then you go to just simple regulatory de-risking. And then if that doesn't work, you guarantee through subsidies, through private public partnerships, that they will get their returns. And fourth, all along, you have to relax capital controls and create bond markets in the local currency so that there is sufficient liquidity for these institutions, these big financial institutions, to make it worthwhile for them to jump in and to fund these infrastructure projects. Well, that's the theory. Okay. This has been diagnosed as an extension of a term that you may have heard before, probably have heard, financialization, which is in many ways considered to be a rather problematic trend, let's put it that way. There are a lot of definitions. One is just sort of like finance has become very big and important. I don't really like that because it's just way too vague. But I think that what captures, what many researchers and theorists who look at financialization critically, what captures their critical gaze is the fact that finance comes to play a role in a wide range of social interactions and the transformation of material factors into the rest of the economy, and tends to take on a life of its own through a market-based system in which securitized assets and bonds and so on are traded simply as a way of storing and increasing wealth. Now, financialization, there's a story about sort of how it came about. I'm not going to get into it, but I will just mention one thing. The problem, at the core of the crash in the Great Financial Crisis was what I'm going to be talking about, the shadow banking network, which basically sort of broke down. It seized up, and there's no more liquidity. And then the whole bubble, that was because the bubble started to break in the housing market, but the contagion spread because of the nature of the kind of financial system that had emerged after the 1990s. This hasn't changed really very much. In other words, one of the things, we have learned nothing, basically. You might want to say, in terms of the issue of financialization. So we still today, the basis of a great deal of what goes on in finance, in our economies, is the construction of securitized collateral that can generate returns for investors, and can also be used in the shadow banking system as a way of raising short-term funds. Banks will use this to be able to settle their books over the course of one day, or one night, one evening, or there may be longer what they call repurchase contracts that may occur, but they're usually really very short. Now, the interesting thing about them is that this develops what has been come to be called the shadow banking system. Not so much because it lurks in the shadows and it's scary, but rather because it's really murky and very difficult to actually tell what's going on. And from the perspective of regulators, but also just as importantly, and maybe even more importantly, from the standpoint of the participants. Because then they have a very difficult time determining when they are taking appropriate levels of risk. One thing that makes shadow banking sort of particularly dangerous is that it is very prone to systemic risk. It operates very frequently using rehypothecation chains, repo chains, in which A may securitize a bunch of, let's say, mortgages or student loans, and B will buy it from A for $100, but promises to sell it back for $101, giving A cash liquidity that it can use for whatever purposes. And then this can happen. There's no legal reason why the collateral can't just keep changing hands in this way that I've sort of described here in this sort of chain. Now, and this is very common. What can happen, however, is that at some point, for whatever reason, it could, there could be an outside shock, there could be a failure in one of the nodes in one of these rehypothecation chains. But since if you put all these chains together, you have a network. Once one part starts to fail, there's a good chance that the other nodes, as it were, in the rest of the system are also going to be in a lot of trouble. Now, this is what, so it's a network. It's not really a market. Sometimes you will hear the phrase repo markets. They're not really markets. They're much more like networks. And that's part of the problem, because as you could sort of, the little demo here, you can see with the little picture of the pins and the thread, each pin can really only see, let's say, the other pin, one of the other pins that it's connected to. But since they're all interconnected, of course, they aren't able to assess the downstream risk that might be involved with other parties who are in the rehypothecation chain for the collateral that they are that they have, ultimately have, well, they're owed back. We can put it that way. So the participants are not blind as such, but they are, dealing with a great deal of opacity, and regulators are as well. In addition, repo stuff and shadow banking in general is usually over the counter. It is done by a company, is done sort of, on a tailor-made basis in a lot of cases. Now, a recent, like in the last 10 years or so, trend has come about, which is called, Benjamin Braun has called asset manager capitalism. An asset manager is a very large financial firm that manages the assets of investors, sometimes by being very active. For a fee, a pension fund will invest in portfolios that the company will try to maximize returns by being very active in reconstructing and reconstructing their portfolio. Now, these sometimes get called impatient capital. In other words, these are firms, investment firms, that are more than willing to simply remove their investments from anything that might threaten their capacity to hit their benchmarks. Passive asset manager companies just sort of match their portfolios to various indexes, and they tend to be patient capital. Now, patient capital is exactly what, if we were going to use private capital is exactly what infrastructure investment would best be matched to, because a company like, say, BlackRock, like one of the biggest asset managers there are, or like right here, they, just sit on their portfolios, and as long as they are matching they maintain them to match the various indices, and then they collect their fees. And they don't do very much they don't do anything in terms of switching things in and out of their portfolios. So they don't exit from their positions very much. So you would think that would be a great sort of way of developing capital that could be used in infrastructure projects. Now, why would we look to them? Well, if we go back to just very quickly to the idea of the shadow banking system as in this form, if we have based the investment in infrastructure in developing countries on the securitization of infrastructure as assets to be collateral in the shadow banking market, or they may be bonds that might be provided by countries as well, not necessarily direct investment in projects and so on. But any one of those possibilities places countries whose finances are not necessarily the best in the world anyway at a great deal of risk when this system unravels. Now, one would hope that at least if there was part of capitalism that was going to be able to come to the rescue, it was going to be patient capital in the form of passive asset managers like BlackRock. Now, even though BlackRock's CEO, Larry Fink, has been sort of on a low-key rampage, demanding that companies go green, there is one very sort of interesting thing we have to note. Patient capital is cautious capital. It focuses primarily on equity indexes that are relatively low in volatility. They do not want to touch things like bonds from emerging market economies. So you can sort of see here in this table from this research company that active asset management companies, they will go into emerging market economies because there are plenty of opportunities for arbitrage and for shorting and things like that. Passive management companies, asset management companies like BlackRock, don't want to bother with this. So they have very little to do with it. And it's part of their business model. They don't want to be involved in stuff like this. Their whole business model is built around being cautious and being able to provide returns to their clients at a pretty low rate of cost for them. Now, where does the ethics of risk come in here? There's risk built into all of this. Finance is about risk. It's one of the fundamental issues of finance is the management of risk and its distribution. Now, when this shadow banking system comes crashing down again, and really, honestly, it will, especially once the value of many investments that have been made become at risk from climate change, the consequences for any financialized climate change infrastructure and the countries that it's supposed to help is going to be really horrific. So we're again going to see not just rich people having to sell one of their mansions. We're going to see people impoverished in the developed world infrastructure projects that are crucial to climate mitigation and adaptation being abandoned. And that's one thing that doesn't seem to have really crossed the mind of, let's say, the proponents of maximizing finance for development. So you might want, one way of thinking about this is whether or not this we have a system in play, whether we have this systemic risk is something that is really worth it. In other words, can we justify it? So on this view, Aaron James has worked on this, and actually in relation to finance, systemic risk in relation to finance. And his view is sort of derived somewhat from Rawls. And his idea of a systemic risk has to do with when agents in some coordinated way impose risk on others, among them, but there are easy, at least some alternatives that are better that could be done and much less risky. In other words, the other way to put it the other way around is that those who are having the risk imposed on them could quite easily, reasonably reject that imposition. And this sort of comes out in terms of what he calls the collective responsibility of due care, social practices which can be expected to cause serious risk to somebody or some group of people should be abandoned if there are alternative practices that are available. Okay, now the one thing that I sort of want to
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we really want to have some discussion of all the other presentations, and could you please come to an end so that we can
okay.
the other
I had just
I mean,
finished with
it's
that.
supposed to be 10 to 15 minutes, isn't it? Maybe we just end here, and those who are left, do you have questions for the presenters?
So I do know that if there are specific questions for Minerva, that you can send them to us and we will send them over to her. And I do see that Fred put his email in the chat if you have specific questions for Fred that you don't think will get answered in time here. And Anna, oh yes, Peter, do you have a question?
Yes.
Yes, go ahead.
My question is to Eric Brown. I want to thank you so much for your presentation. It's really enlightening. My question is, you said something about we need to raise people, you need to raise the awareness, the educational awareness of people to a certain level before you can engage them in the issue of the debate of climate change. And to that extent, I'm asking, when you were talking about financialization, what is the role that finance plays when it comes to the sensitization of climate change?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. That was actually kind of the last slide that I was going to show. I think that the approach that the World Bank and the IMF and so on are propagating and kind of pushing as much as they can is really quite dangerous and a massive distraction from the kinds of things that really could be done that I think maybe some other people have discussed in more constructive ways. One thing that that I encounter, even as someone who teaches in a business school and teaches people who study finance, is that they don't know that stuff like this is going on. And I think that while it's very important to make people aware of the how important and how significant climate change is going to be, making them aware that there are plenty of powerful organizations that see this more as an opportunity to make profit, and to weaponize it essentially, as opposed to act in terms of their so-called duty of care, is also extremely important. So yes, I'm sorry.
Great. Are there any other questions right off the top of anybody's minds? Otherwise, I have a general question that I think was kind of brewing for everybody as I was listening. So, but I want to take yours if you have them. Okay.
I don't know if I can still ask another question.
Yes, go ahead. Go ahead.
I want to ask a question directed to Minerva Lopez.
Unfortunately, Minerva had to jump off. So if you have the question, please share it in the chat and then we'll send it to her.
All right.
Yeah, sorry about that. Well, I guess, so my general question that I think was just kind of mustering from Minerva's and as everybody's in this session, I feel like there's obviously this parallel talking about language, what terms we're using, the liberalism, being cautious and afraid. And I'm just curious, if we were having this discussion maybe 25 years ago without social media, without the ability to connect like this, without these modern tools, does the general public now having more ability to call out authorities, call out authoritarian issues, does that affect the terms and the language that policymakers are using and experts using? Are experts becoming afraid, or, as Eric was saying, are banks becoming too cautious and afraid to overemphasize their findings because, they might be publicly shamed, ignored, or there's this public vigilantism behind, anything that gets nitpicked or done wrong. So I'm just curious if you find that has any play in your work for our speakers.
I may be the only one left.
I got Anna here and
oh no, I'm not.
I have
Oh,
Fred.
Oh no, oh, okay, I'm sorry.
But if you have a say, go ahead.
Well, I mean, one good thing about asset management companies, especially the large passive ones, is that they really do, because they want to be able to maximize their portfolios, they want companies to, this is an argument a lawyer, Madison Coleman, has been making, that they want climate disclosure from companies generally, and now they're going to get it from the SEC because at least the stock for privately and publicly traded firms, because Gary Gensler has pushed that forward, because they want companies to do as much as they can to internalize negative externalities that might have to do with say greenhouse gases and so on that affect other companies in their portfolio. Now, that's sort of a purely mercenary or profit-oriented motivation, but it does, at least I think, describe some sort of awareness that also that the public does sort of care about what is being invested in and why. So the more there is going to, I think, going to be a move for more transparency, which might be a good thing.
Yeah. Anna or Fred, any thoughts?
I mean, just a comment which Andrea's presentation made me think of, that so much in this discourse is still unknown to the general public. Like when we talk about likely, very likely, probable, like there's just not enough knowledge about it. So even though there are forums to talk about it, it's not necessarily the case that we have the information or possess the knowledge to be constructive about it, I suppose.
Sure. Fred, any?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's a good point. I feel like, you know, maybe some of these, I mean, a kind of a self-criticism, I suppose, if I say the highly abstract discussions about political and philosophical principles aren't necessarily the going to like cut through to the public or have the kind of practical practical applicability, because people aren't aware of these
Sure.
debates. Which is maybe one, I don't know, maybe that's one reason why I would say Rawlsianism probably isn't sufficient as a kind of ecologically friendly kind of liberalism, maybe because it is based around a lot of these abstract discussions. And I didn't get to say this in the presentation because obviously I had time constraints, but I think my favorite brand of liberalism would be something that is more publicly engaged and maybe more, you know, deliberative, you know, more involving more direct deliberative democracy or something like that. Yeah.
Great, interesting. Well, I want to respect everybody's time. So if there is no more pressing questions, then we can sign off. And tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. US Central Time will be the next round of the symposium. So those of you that are going to dinner or going to eat, enjoy your meals. And thank you so much for joining us, and have a great day, evening.